Our reading for today, the Passion of our Lord Christ, drawn from the four Gospels. They put on him a splendid robe and sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that same day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You've brought me this man before me as one subverting the people. See now, I have examined him before you and have found nothing in him guilty of any of your charges against him. And neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Mark this, he has done nothing worthy of death. I will have him punished and release him." Now at the feast, it was a governor's custom to release to the crowd any one prisoner whom they asked for. They had then a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. He was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the uprising in the city. Pilate knew that it was out of malice that the chief priest handed Jesus over. Therefore he said to them, "Do you want me to release to you Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" While Pilate was sitting in the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message. "Do not have anything to do with that man. I have suffered much over him today in a dream." Again Pilate addressed them, for he wished to release Jesus. He said to them, "What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? What shall I do with him whom you call the King of the Jews?" They all cried out, "Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I've found no guilt worthy of death in him. I will therefore punish him and let him go." They cried out all the louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers of the governor led him away into the praetorium. They gathered the whole band of soldiers around him. They stripped him and they put on him a purple robe. When they had woven a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and they took the reed and struck him on the head. They knelt down and did homage. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I bring him out to you, that you might know that I find him not guilty." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man!" When the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I do not find him guilty." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more afraid and went again into the judgment hall and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you, and I have the power to release you?" Jesus answered, "You would not have any power at all over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who handed me over to you has the greater sin." This prompted Pilate to go on trying to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in the place that is called the Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was the preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" Chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but rather a riot was underway, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this man. See to it yourselves." And all the people responded, "His blood be on us and our children." Then Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, gave sentence that it should be as they demanded. He released to them Barabbas, for whom they had asked, the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. He had Jesus flogged and then gave him over to their will to be crucified. The soldiers mocked him, stripped him of his purple robe, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him.
Welcome again for interview. We will consider tonight the circumstance that led to the guilty verdict and crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
I'm back, and this will cover the second time this case was placed in my jurisdiction after it was referred to me by the Tetrarch Herod Antipas. I received word that the case of Jesus versus the Sanhedrin was being referred back to me. A messenger came to inform me that Jesus' accusers and Jesus were back in my courtyard. With my anger renewed, I rose from my ivory stela, postponed the remaining cases before me, and went out to face the crowd. By now, it had largely reconvened in the palace square. The same unpleasant people I had confronted earlier when I began this Jewish tragedy were again before me. Without waiting for the prosecution to reopen its case, I seized the initiative and announced, "You brought the defendant before this tribunal on a charge of subversion. After personally and publicly examining him, I did not find this man guilty of any of your prime charges against him. Neither did the Tetrarch Herod Antipas, for he was referred the case back to me. Even if he committed infractions of your religious law, Jesus of Nazareth has done nothing to deserve death." This provoked a loud cry from the crowd for the first time, arising as a sullen rumble of disapproval, punctuated by isolated shouts of,
"Away with him, convict him, he's guilty."
The tension in the atmosphere was building. Looking down at the plaintiffs, speaking in a conversational tone, so that only they would hear me, "I see you're managing the masses rather well. This also means that as these people get out of hand, you'll have to answer for the consequences. Now, in order to preserve the peace, I ask that you withdraw the charges against this man, since they've not stood up in court. Such a gesture would effectively end this hearing without my being compelled to declare that the defendant is innocent. Perhaps you can build your case against him another time when you have more conclusive evidence. For my part, I'll flog him as an object lesson for disturbing the peace and release him." I searched the faces of the Sanhedrin for some sign of concession, but they exhibited only unbending resolution. Therefore, I had no other choice but to reopen this sorry business. All the evidence of the prosecution had been presented earlier in the hearing. The defense, such as it was, had also been given in one sentence: "My kingdom is not of this world." Inside the palace, meanwhile, Procula, my wife, had awoken ill. The change of diet from Caesarea to Jerusalem had brought her dysentery. She decided to stay in bed for the rest of the morning and soon dropped off to sleep again.
I heard my husband defending the prophet. No one else had a word to say in his behalf. The case reached its climax. Pilate formally declared Jesus innocent.
Away with him, condemn him, crucify him.
Hear me, as prefect of Judea and a representative of His Imperial Majesty Tiberius Caesar, and as judge of the provincial tribunal of Jerusalem, I hereby declare Jesus of Nazareth not guilty of the charges you've brought against him. I'm releasing the defendant. This court is adjourned. With that, Pilate rose from his judgment seat and ordered a contingent from the Jerusalem cohort to untie Jesus and escort him under imperial safe conduct as far as Galilee. As I watched the tribune and the auxiliary leave escorting Jesus,
Pointing to Pilate, crucify him.
A blood-curdling yell rose as the people, now a lynch mob, stormed up to the tribunal from all sides and seized Pilate before any of the palace guards could assist him. Pummeling his head and body and lacerating his flesh, Pontius Pilate was dead even before he could be hoisted into a crude cross fashioned by the mob from timber. Oh, I wakened from my grisly nightmare, a grotesque fantasy, a morning dream, shouts from the crowd, and in fact penetrated the palace. And my fears supplied the framework in which to arrange those shouts. Overcome with relief, I sent somebody in attendance to ask where my husband was. Learning of the trial still in progress, I was alarmed once again. Even since the notice of Jesus' arrest was delivered to the palace, I knew instinctively that Pilate would eventually have to hear the case. But did my dream have a prophetic dimension? This is the usual posture for Roman dreams. I called for a wax tablet and quickly scrolled this warning. Keep your guard closely about you and have nothing to do with this innocent man, for I have suffered much today in a dream because of him.
meanwhile, I thought I had finally found a solution to this situation. Since it's my custom each Passover to release one prisoner chosen by the people, I reminded the multitude of this annual festival amnesty. But instead of allowing unlimited free choice of candidates being picked, I narrowed the selection to just two. Whom do you want me to release? Jesus, Barabbas, or Jesus of Nazareth? I presented to them a choice of a notorious public enemy, a thief, the murdering insurrectionist who had led a riot against them, or Jesus of Nazareth, the prophet. It was at this point that Procula's message was delivered to me. Since the prosecution was trying to determine what to do, I had time to read her note. The warning could hardly apply since I was well guarded. Besides, I put no stock in dreams, but did agree with her unsolicited verdict on Jesus. Well, which of these two Jesuses should I release to you, the Nazarene or Barabbas?
Barabbas, Barabbas.
I was dumbfounded in the moments of hesitation, which I had interpreted as confusion. The prosecution had marshaled the crowd through couriers, which persuaded the people in the name of the great Sanhedrin to demand the release of Barabbas, who had killed some of their own, instead of Jesus of Nazareth. Then what about this Jesus of Nazareth?
Let him be crucified.
Why? What evil has he done?
Away with him. Crucify
Crucify
him.
him.
Give us Barabbas.
Why? For what crime? I've not found him guilty of any capital offense. I will therefore flog him and free him. I had Jesus brought inside the palace courtyard for scourging. The captain, who'd been keeping an eye on things from inside the praetorium, now barked at a command to the auxiliaries. They gathered around the prisoner, stripped him, and administered the fustigatio, the Roman flogging, which punishes someone as a warning against further wrongdoing. It's lighter than the severe scourging that precedes capital punishment. I witnessed the scene, hoping that the stripes would bring Jesus sufficiently to his senses so as to offer a better defense, playing on human behavior. I also intended the scourging to win the people's sympathy for the accused. Now the soldiers played their game of mockery with him, a barbaric custom which Romans had not shaken off from their ancient past. They played their version of king for a day, planting a thorny crown on his head and mocking him and beating him. These men were anti-Semites, and they took out their hatred on him. They shoved a reed into his right hand as a scepter, but he let it fall. These rowdy troops now fell on their knees, endearingly saluted him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They filed by one, pretending to do honor. Then slapping his cheeks and spitting in his face, they took up the dropped reed and used it to beat the crown of thorns into his scalp. Bleeding from the scourge and thorns, Jesus said nothing. Pilate reappeared in the courtyard and halted the mocking. Then he led Jesus out of the tribunal and exhibited him to the multitude. "Here's the man. I bring him out to you to let you know that I find no guilt in him. By this scourging, he has been punished for offending you. Look at him. You charge him with claiming to be the king. Well, here's your king, wearing royal purple and crowned with thorns." The soldiers started laughing, and I encouraged it, hoping that mockery would slack the crowd's thirst for blood. It was one thing to demand execution of a healthy and unharmed prisoner, but quite another to insist on it for a defenseless, beaten, and ridiculed wretch. "Behold the man!"
Crucify him! Crucify him!
Crucify, crucify.
Crucify him! Crucify him!
At first, shouting came only from a small group of prosecutors below the tribune. There was some sympathy at first for the beaten Jesus who had taken at the mass assembly, but soon more and more took up the chant, and the general mood was once again galvanized for condemning Jesus to death. "You crucify him. Take him and crucify him yourself. I find no case against him." I was preparing to announce final acquittal in the closing of the court. Caiaphas walked up and spoke face to face with me.
We have a law, Honorable Prefect, and according to this law, this man must die. He is claimed to be the Son of God before the whole Sanhedrin.
The Son of God? I was a little more than slightly disturbed by that, but I was also irritated.
Yes, this is the greatest offense of our law, the worst blasphemy.
Some superstition was aroused in me by this new information, but my judicial sense was infuriated. The prosecution was introducing an entirely new charge, a religious one, which was unrelated to the previous political indictments. In fairness to the judge, the court, and the defendant, it should have been cited much earlier. "This is an entirely new charge. You should have raised this when I called for accusations at the start of the trial." Now I have to hold a private hearing of this alleged claim to be Son of God. With that, I had Jesus brought back again into the palace. A claim of divinity is also a bit unnerving for us Romans. Fundamentally, we're rather religious, or at least superstitious, even if I thought of myself as enlightened and highly skeptical. I began carefully to probe to determine if their charge was legitimate. Where have you come from? Jesus didn't reply. You won't speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you or to crucify you? Jesus?
You would have no authority at all over me if it had not been given to you from above. Therefore, the prosecutors has the greater sin.
This mysterious language, referring again to the higher power for which he is evidently a tool, convinced me that further conversations with Jesus would lead nowhere. The man seemed resolved not to enter any defense for himself. I kept Jesus inside the praetorium while I returned to the tribunal. I realized for the second time that Jesus had, in fact, mentioned something in his defense. It was only a sentence like the first occasion. My kingship is not of this world. He had said, the prosecution has the greater sin. The last word also meant failure or error. Pilate knew, and clearly Jesus also knew, that the legal process now taking place was sin, error, failure. My conscience would not allow me to condemn this innocent man, so I now renewed my efforts to release Jesus. Despite the uncompromising attitude of the people, I had to wonder to what extent they had hired lackeys rounded up by the prosecution. As prefect of Judea, I cajoled, debated, argued, and finally threatened.
This is a case involving religious offenses. You did not need to reopen the trial. You simply should have countersigned the execution order of the Sanhedrin. We have supreme jurisdiction over all religious questions affecting Jews. If Rome, you, Pilate, had not removed the jus gladii from our judicial body, you would not even have had to struggle with this unpleasant task of trying to fathom Jewish law, or to understand why such supreme blasphemy should only be punished by death.
I found it difficult to answer that argument. I had private reservations about the motives which led Caiaphas and the priests to seek Jesus' death. To what extent were they based on the alleged blasphemy, or did they stem also from envy at Jesus' success? Or was this merely a case of retaliation for his attacks on them and their temple businesses? It's impossible to debate such motives publicly, for that would impugn the veracity of the Jewish authorities before their own people, an offense which would have terminated my usefulness in Judea. It was while I was hesitating that the leaders of the prosecution pressed their final attack.
Noble Perfect, our way of life, our religious future are at stake in this trial. If this deceiver is released, he will subvert our nation and also our most holy faith. If such cardinal blasphemy, which we have all heard with our own ears, is not punished, then Israel is lost. Tiberius Caesar has charged you to uphold our religious customs. If you let this man go free, you are not Caesar's friend. Furthermore, anyone who would make himself a king treasonably defies Caesar.
Anna's statement could be translated only one way. If you free this man, the Sanhedrin will send a delegation to Tiberias to bring the following charges against you. 1, disobedience to the emperor and failing to support Jewish law. And 2, criminal neglect of duty for failing to punish someone who committed a maestas by setting himself up as a subversive counter-king to the Roman emperor. Considering my probationary status ever since the fall of Sejanus and my various troubles with the Jews, such a dual argument before Tiberius would lead to loss of office, political career, or even life itself if the charge of treason was sustained. If the Judean authorities had complained to Tiberius about something so minimal as the few gilded shields, they would most certainly appeal to him in this matter. They obviously considered it be much more importance. The trial was over. It was getting late in the morning. The sun was hot, and they wanted to be done with this sorry affair. I'd lost again. Tribune, bring the prisoner Jeshua out of the palace for sentencing. My practical Roman mind reminded me there was now only one alternative to the sentence: either condemn apparently innocent man to save oneself, or acquit Jesus in sacrificing myself. Thinking through history, I could not think of any man in this situation who would in fact sacrifice himself on the altar of principle. No, even idealists like Cato and Socrates would not have surrendered their lives for someone or a higher cause. Certainly not this visionary and unfathomable prisoner, a man seemingly so resigned to death that he made no defense for himself. As Jesus, still dressed in purple and crowned with thorns, was led out, "Here is your king." In response, one scribe, in obvious hatred, twisting his features, clenched his fist and screamed,
Away with him! Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!
him.
"Shall I crucify your king?"
We have no king but Caesar.
This answer was hypocritical, shrewd, and strongly underscored their threat. Those who did not defend themselves in Roman trials were usually given 3 opportunities to change their mind before sentence was pronounced. "Jesus of Nazareth, have you anything to say in your defense?" Jesus did not reply. He was bleeding and perspiring and apparently weakening physically. "Jesus of Nazareth, do you have anything to say in your defense?" There was no response. "Jesus of Nazareth, this is your final chance. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Again, there was no response. Legally and judicially, I would now hope to save my conscience. Since there was no defense, I had no alternative but to convict. Simmering under the sun for almost 3 hours, the mob was restive and impatient, each contributing to aroma of sweat which hovered over the palace plaza. They had stood watching me defy their will and that of the great Sanhedrin, rumbling and a subdued roaring, accompanied with by catcalls for crucifixion and several screaming obscenities, which were now being thrown at me. Isolated scuffles began to break out between auxiliary soldiers and people at the end of the crowd. Demands for crucifixion were building to a sickening crescendo, as if the crowd were trying to change my mind by the sheer force of sound itself. The palace square was becoming a mass of shaking of fists. Some of the people were holding their arms straight in a cruciform fashion while yelling, "Crucify!" I could not miss the message. Everything was indicating the approach of a full-dressed riot. Eyeing my troops at that moment, I did not feel I could take another riot, so I waved my arms overhead to silence the tumult and indicated that I was finally ready to pass sentence. I had a bowl and a basin of water brought out to the tribunal. Hear me, men of Israel. This court cannot pronounce Jesus of Nazareth guilty, but because your great Sanhedrin has condemned him to death, and since the Roman prefect must respect and protect Jewish religious law, this prisoner will be crucified. A great roar of approval filled the air. When it was finally subsided, I, in full view of the multitude, washed my hands in the basin. My hands are clean of this man's blood.
His blood be on us
And our
and our
children.
children.
They were using the words of the Old Testament formula to assume accountability for themselves. So be it. I dried my hands with inner revulsion and gave the orders. Release Barabbas. Let Jesus be crucified. Soldiers took the condemned into the courtyard, stripped off the purple cloak, and after additional mockery and scourging, to prepare him for crucifixion, dressed him in his own clothes again. They made him shoulder the patibulum of wood, the transverse beam from which to form the cross, and it would be fastened to one of the upright stakes already standing at the crucifixion site, Golgotha.
So ends our dramatic reading for today.